So without further ado, someone who is going to really entertain us this afternoon that hardly needs an introduction. He's nationally famous everywhere for being able to tell lots of lies and give you a really great history, though, on everything. So let's welcome Mr. Morris Shapiro.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, team. Really appreciate the team here at the MAC. Did a wonderful podcast with John a little while ago. This exhibition, by the way, is world class. And I'm so proud that Park West was able to assemble it. These are all from the Park West collection. We've been collecting Toulouse-Lautrec's work now and archiving it for over 50 years. There are over 50 works in the exhibition. And it is the kind of show that could travel anywhere in the world and be considered world class. So truly, truly is. So take the time, if you haven't done already, to just absorb this show. Look at every single piece. Really take it in and remember it, because assembling a collection like this is special. I honestly believe it is probably one of the finest exhibitions of his work that's been assembled in many, many years, anywhere in the world. So really do take some time, please. My interest in Lautrec goes back about, maybe, 60 years or so. I've been a big fan of his work for a long time. People ask me all the time who my favorite artists are. And they're always changing. I always have new artists that I like to explore and look at and learn about. But he's always in my top 10. And we're going to explore his work a little bit. For me, it's really as much about the art and the historical implications, the influences, etc., as it is about the life of the artist. And all of us can relate to this. We all are here where we are in our lives because of particular circumstances, people we've met, chance experiences, mentors and teachers we've had in our lives, things that just happen to put us on a path to where we are in life, right? With artists, it's the same thing, but because they're such extraordinary people, such remarkable people, it's always fascinating to get into the texture of their lives, if you will, the fabric of their lives. And we're going to explore a little bit of that today, and hopefully that will take you deeper into the life and art of this amazing individual. So let's see if we can get my PowerPoint working here. Okay, there we go. There's his signature on a lithograph. So there are really three things I think is important to just in general think about as we go through this quick discussion here. Lithography was a wonderful art form. It was the commercial art form of the time. It's done by taking a slab of limestone, Bavarian limestone, which is ground down to a flat surface, very porous surface. The artist draws on the stone with a greasy crayon or liquid form. And then the grease is fixed to the stone through a chemical process. Then the stone is wet with a sponge. The water sticks to the negative areas where the artist does not draw because of the antipathy of oil and water. Everybody with me? Okay, so wet areas and dry areas of oil. Then a grease-based ink is put on a roller like a rolling pin. It gets rolled onto the slab of limestone. The ink sticks to where the artist drew and not to the negative areas that are wet. A piece of paper is placed on top of the stone. It's run through a press. The pressure forces the ink from the stone to the piece of paper. It's peeled off, it's examined, it's stacked to dry. And then the next example is printed. Same way. You wet the stone, ink the stone, etc. Every example done individually by hand, right? Very tedious and technical process. The tricky part is when you look at a color lithograph, the famous Divan Japonais, take a look at that. Every color required a separate stone and separate printing process, stone by stone, color by color by color. Can you imagine the challenge to do that? So you've got to think about the sequence of the colors. What's the order of the coloration? Which color is going to go down first and second and third and fourth? You've got to think about the translucency of the inks or the opacity of the inks. So again, color by color, the sequence, the translucency, the transparency, the registration, making sure everything lines up perfectly. It's a tedious and challenging prospect. It was the commercial means of reproduction in the 19th century. Menus, cigar box wrappers, calendars, all the things that were commercially needed to be printed were done through lithography. Lautrec is the artist who sees the potential of lithography to become an art form, and it becomes really his primary art form. This is an interesting thing that many people don't know about his work. The majority of his paintings, his actual oil paintings, he painted on cardboard and on canvas, were studies for his lithographs, for preparations for his lithographs. And when he showed his lithograph in exhibitions, he was very proud of it. He would show oftentimes the different states, meaning the progressions of the image as it evolved, which is remarkable. And also he sometimes showed the stones, the actual lithographic stones, brought them in for exhibitions of his work as as well. So he saw this medium, something that was not just for commercial purposes, but something that could really move in the direction of a fine art and innovated the fine art. So that's an important aspect of his work. The second, I would say, is his virtuosity. When he took that lithographic stone and he would sharpen that grease crayon to like a pencil point, really fine pencil point, and he would just kiss that lithographic stone with this exquisite draftsmanship. He was classically trained. He spent his whole life drawing, started when he was a child, all the way up to when he passed away. He was a brilliant, brilliant draftsman. And it's really, his virtuosity is really unmatched. We're going to talk about the L series over here, but spend some time when you look particularly at the works that aren't the posters, that had a different purpose, the works that were much more intimate, much more articulate. You'll really appreciate that great draftsmanship. And finally, the idea that he perfectly captured his time. What can you say that's a better compliment to an artist, right? To say, if I say to you, if I walk up to a person on the street and I say, Moulin Rouge, 19th century, can-can dancers, what do you think of? You think of a Toulouse-Lautrec image, right? Exactly, right? Is there a better compliment you can pay to an artist? What did Norman Rockwell do? Right? He's exactly the same thing, right? What did Leroy Neiman do? If you know the work of Leroy Neiman, same thing, right? So this is a path that was put forth by Toulouse-Lautrec saying, this is my life, this is my milieu, this is what's happening in my world. I'm going to be the artist that puts the imprint of that time and place into history. That's a brilliant thing when you think about that. So, well, the stones are actually scraped away. Once the image is drawn upon the stone, then they'll take another stone, put it on top of it, scrape off the grease, right, and then prepare the next drawing. There are some stones still in existence. They're hard to find today. They're very heavy. Of course, they're thick, slabs of stone, very difficult. And again, feel free to jump in if you have any questions. So there he is, Henri-Marie Raymond Monthaven, Vicomte de Toulouse-Lautrec. I'm going to call him Henry, because I don't want to go Henri all day. What do you know of culture? 1864, 1901. You guys doing the math, right? Okay, that's 37, right? He lived to be 36 years old. I put a quote underneath it by Arsène Alexander, a very famous writer and critic. He said, "There are men whose lives are shortened precisely because they live so intensely. They rarely live to old age." Isn't that amazing? Think about that. How many artists can you think of like that? We'll talk about Mozart, right? Charlie Parker. Yeah, goes on and on. All right, so let's talk about his production. 20 years, really, his career. Over 6,000 works of art. Talk about burning, living intensely. There you go. 737 paintings, 275 watercolors, 363 prints and posters, and around 5,000 drawings by this artist. That's burning hard. That's burning it really hard. And he said himself, I expect to burn myself out by the time I'm 40. And he was prescient about that, was he not? Yep. All right, I've got some fun quotes. I'm going to be sort of peppering this discussion with some cool quotes for you. These are quotes from Henry himself. I will always be a thoroughbred hitched up to a rubbish cart. By that he meant he was, grotesque to look at. We'll talk about his disabilities and his appearance. But he was a thoroughbred, right? He says, no, I'm not afraid of falling down drunk. After all, I'm so close to the ground. He said, ugliness, and of course, he was considered, if not ugly, highly unattractive. No matter where it is, always has a beautiful side. It's fascinating to uncover beauty where no one else can see it. I think that's very profound. And I just wanted to mention one of his technical quotes. He talked about landscapes. He said landscape was nothing. He really disliked landscape painting, which was very prominent at the time. The Impressionists, of course, were primarily plein air painters painting outside. Landscape is nothing and should be nothing but an accessory to make the character of the figure more intelligible. It was all about the human form in his work, figure, and the personality of the figure. All right, here is Yvette Gilbert. She was a very famous singer, and they became great friends. But when she first met him, she was shocked, and here's how she described her meeting with him. Try to imagine a dark-haired head, enormous, with a very red face and black beard, oily, greasy skin, a nose big enough for 2 faces, and a mouth like a slash across the face from cheek to cheek with drooping purplish pink lips, thick and flattened like a hem around that frightful obscene opening. Finally, I looked into Lautrec's eyes. They were beautiful, huge, wide, full of warmth. As I continued to look into his eyes, Lautrec, aware of my gaze, snatched off his glasses. He knew his one redeeming feature, and he offered it to me wholeheartedly. There he is, always playful. His photography, of course, was emerging as an art form. And who's doing stuff like this with photography in the 1890s? Come on, that's so advanced, right? So I suspect the photograph on the right was taken first because the one on the left kind of blurs into the wall, for the double exposure. But this is a triple self-portrait, right? So he's there on the right, he's there on the left, and if you look at what's on the canvas, can you see it? It's the self-portrait of the same profile in the photograph. I mean, that is just like crazy, crazy creative. So there he is. That's what he looked like as he wandered around Paris with his cane, waddling around. He had a very hard time walking. Very painful for him to walk. Let's talk about something which is hard for us to understand in America, and that is aristocracy and royalty. We don't get it, right? We live in a world where royalty is not a part of our lives. Now, the aristocrats, the royals, they had a dynasty. They have dynasties that go back thousands of years in some cases. In terms of Henry's life, his father's side, they had a 1,000-year dynasty of ruling the south of France. 1,000 years, this family, generation after generation, ruling this area, building wealth. His mother's ancestors led 1,000 men in the Crusades, and they helped conquer Jerusalem in the year 1096. Imagine that. That's the history of his family. His parents were first cousins. Their mothers were sisters, okay? And it was not illegal or unheard of for royals to intermingle and to have children. Consequently, his congenital condition when he was born. Now, with dynasties, the most important thing, I was talking about this with John in the podcast earlier, most important thing to them was not their individual lives, their time in the world, but it was their preservation of the dynasty to make sure it went to the next generation and the next generation to go on for another 1,000 years and to never besmirch it. Never put a black mark on your family name because that is your most important asset. People in the royal world did not work. They didn't have jobs. It was considered beneath them to have a job, right? So imagine this family now raising this son, their only son. They had another son after him that died very shortly after birth. Imagine the son who's, horribly disfigured and decides he wants to become an artist. Oh my God, an artist? A craftsperson? Someone doing something with their hands, right? And then he goes into Paris. And not only Paris, but he goes to Montmartre, which is the area of sin in Paris, and starts making images of cafes and singers and brothels. It was a horrible thing for his family, terrible, terrible thing for his family to consider. His uncle actually, and Henry of course knew this, he knew we had this very difficult relationship with his family. He kept pushing it in their faces at some point. He actually went to visit his uncle in the south of France, brought 8 of his paintings of brothels with him to show his uncle, right? His uncle flipped out, and when Henry left, he left the paintings there on purpose. Behind him, his uncle burned them, right? And he had a witness to make sure that everybody knew he was actually burning his nephew's paintings, right? That's the kind of antipathy that was going on in this family relationship, right? It's incredible to think about that. Here's his father. He was an eccentric dude, say the least. Alphonse de Toulouse-Lautrec, Circassian chainmail. Now his father, all he wanted to do was hunt. That's all he did. He hunted, he fished, he raised birds and falcons and had dog kennels and bought horses and traveled all over Europe. He was an absent father. He was almost never home. And he had very little relationship with his father. And his father really just, didn't really care much about him, but was concerned that he didn't do anything to besmirch the family name. That was his most important factor. So he never really had much of a relationship with his father. Here's his mother. Adele was her name, the Countess. And this is a painting by Henry when he was 18 years old of his mother. Beautiful painting, isn't it? And she was a devout Catholic. She was very, very spiritual, spent every morning in Mass. And they had a very unhappy marriage. Alphonse was not around, and she was there to kind of take care of Henry. She doted on him, of course, because of his infirmity and his disabilities. And eventually, she was really struggling because as he grew in Paris, in Montmartre, became much more famous, the fact that he was producing art of the type he was producing was becoming apparent to her and her family and the rest of the royals, and it was very embarrassing for them. Henry became an alcoholic. He started drinking when he was 10 years old, and he became a serious alcoholic. He suffered from very debilitating alcoholism, and at the end of his life from syphilis as well. So he had hallucinations. He was paranoid at the end of his life. He was unable to work. This was all coming back to the family. And she eventually decided she had to put him into an institution to try and sober him up, which was a horrible thing for the dynasty. Your son is going into an institution. I mean, that's as bad as it can get. And they put him in the institution. He got sober and he got released because he asked a friend to bring him some pencils, colored pencils, charcoal, pastels, and paper. And he made a series of circus drawings when he was in the institution. They are amongst the most beautiful drawings I've ever seen. They are absolutely exquisite, and he made them all from his imagination. He just visualized horses and acrobats and dancing bears and clowns. They're exquisite drawings. He showed them to the doctor that was the head of the institution. He said, "Look, I'm sober. I can make art again." And they let him go, let him out. And within 6 months, he was dead. Went back to drinking, drank himself to death, lived again to be 36 years old. His mother went through all that. After his death, she became, along with his dealer, Maurice Joyon, who was the primary dealer of Lautrec, responsible for trying to preserve his legacy. And she opened up the museum, which is now in Albi, France, the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum, which has the largest collection of his work in the world. There he is at 14. You can see those lips that Yvette Gilbert was talking about. And he was a very precocious boy, very intelligent boy. He was born, of course, with dwarfism. I had a client who was a surgeon, a bone surgeon, osteopath bone surgeon, and he studied Lautrec, and he diagnosed it as osteogenesis imperfecta. That's what he told me the disease was, along with his dwarfism. And it's a brittle bone disease. Basically, I've been told that some children who are born with this, their bones break when they're coming through the birth canal. I mean, it's a really horrible disease. And so he had that as well. He had deformity and pain and weakness in his legs. At the age of 10, he began to have hairline and microfractures. His mother took him to a quack doctor. They tried to pull his legs out, put them in apparatuses, and medicine was a really rough scenario back there in terms of osteopathy. And so that was a hard time for him. And then when he was 13, when doctor came to visit, his father said, "Get up and say hello to the doctor." And he stood up and his cane slipped. And he fell down and he broke his femur, his left femur, you know, the bone right here. And it was very painful for him. He was in a long period of recovery, immobile. And then the following summer, his mother took him on a pilgrimage to Lourdes in France, where supposedly the Virgin Mary appeared to a young girl. So we're just hoping that there could be some sort of spiritual intercession there with a lot of prayer. And he stepped in a ditch and broke his other leg on that journey. So both of his legs were broken as a teenager. And of course, they never recovered. He grew to be 4 feet 11 inches tall. That's how tall he was. So as I said, he was cheerful. He was very compassionate. He loved his cousins and his friends. Highly intelligent. He wrote wonderful letters. He was classically educated, of course, and he studied Latin, Greek, and he was fluent in English. He'd been many trips to London. He loved London as well, and his English was quite good. Here's his first influence. This is René Princitot, and Princitot was a family friend, and he was deaf. And he taught himself to read lips, and Henry really admired that, the fact that here was an older man who had overcome his disability, and it really inspired him. He said, I may be able to do this, and Princitot encouraged him to continue to draw as he was doing already. And Princitot was the first to really see that he had a gift, a serious gift, and he encouraged him to continue to do it. His father and his uncles always liked to draw as well. They were always very good artists in the family. They just never considered it important enough to pursue. It's just something to do as a hobby in essence. So look at the painting. Isn't it interesting? You got this beautiful image of a horse, and Henry, of course, one of the great equestrian artists of all time. It has a loose, kind of almost impressionist brushstroke to it. And look at the sense of movement. Very important aspect, the dynamism and movement in the work. Henri was always focused on that. It was a great inspiration for him all through his life. You see a great sense of dynamism. Here was a Forain, very famous artist. Forain was an artist who was one of the first to sort of depict the culture of the time, the people of the time, the aristocracy and the well-to-do people in a cynical way, sort of a sarcastic way of looking at them, and also had a great sense of draftsmanship in his work. So that was another great inspiration for Henri. And then, of course, the great Degas. Now, Degas was 30 years older than Henri, but Henri idolized him. He thought Degas was one of the greatest artists who ever drew breath. And he tried to get close to Degas, and Degas would have nothing to do with him. He just sort of tolerated him. He would look at him and say hello to him in the street or whatever. But Henri studied his work, and you see the cropping effect in particular. That was one of Degas' real contributions to art history. Henri adopted that as well. And look at the face of the woman, the sense of character there. He took that, deeply into his work as well. One of the shows that he did, one of his first one-man shows actually in Paris, Degas came to it. And Henri was there for the show. And Degas walked in the room, and Henri was like, oh my God, it's Degas, my idol. And he walked around, saw the whole exhibition. It was like 30, 35 pieces in the show. Didn't say a word to anybody, didn't even acknowledge Henri at all. Came in, looked at the whole show, and as he was walking out the door, he turned around to Henri and he said, well, I guess you're one of us. And I was like, yeah, thank you, God. I arrived. Degas liked my work. Here's his first teacher. This is Bonnat. And Bonnat was a disciplinarian, as you can see by the look on his face, right? Look at that dude. He'd scare anybody to death, right? So his parents put him in this school because he was a classic atelier. And Bonnat was a teacher, of course, and taught the classical method. And he was the Birkin bag of portrait artists. You know what I mean by that? Ladies are all laughing. The men are like, what's he talking about, right? You had to be qualified to even be considered for him to paint your portrait, okay? You couldn't buy that Birkin bag from him. You had to be qualified to do that. So that's Bonnat, the first teacher, and he hated Henri. He just tolerated him. Even after Henri died, he wrote nasty things about him, and he was his pupil. Isn't that horrible to think about that? Bonnat was promoted to the École des Beaux-Arts, became one of the professors of the great art school in Paris. So he shut down his ateliers with the students, and then Henri went to another studio, which was Corman, coming up. So this is a painting by Bonnat, one of his religious paintings, The Raising of Lazarus. And here's what he said about the Impressionists. They're humbugs. They're upstart frauds. They discredit the good name of art. Those Impressionists, what do they know of art? So, we're just talking about that at the table, right? Talking about lunch, how we try and not shut ourselves off from new things as we get old, It's a bad thing to do. But he was that kind of guy. Here's a painting Henri did when he studied with Bonnat, 18 years old. Isn't that beautiful? That's a very interesting painting, intelligent painting for basically a kid, a teenager. There's Corman, his next teacher. He was thin, emaciated, and he taught classical art, but he also was open to modernism. He had a much more liberal and progressive attitude, which really fostered the students that worked with him. Henri stayed in the atelier with Bonnat for, I think it was 6 years, if I'm not mistaken. Quite a while, 6 years, right, Lee? Yeah. So he really was dedicated. And, it was interesting because they learned the classics, and then at night they would go into Montmartre and party. It was a whole different situation. But he appreciated Corman's work. There they are in the classroom. This is Bonnat right here. See if my thing will work. Can I get he's right here. This is Corman right here, right? And he's looking at a painting, and all the students are looking at it, right, with rapt attention, except Henri. He's on the other side. He was a scamp. And so he's like, I'm not going to look at that painting, right? Great picture. This guy? Yeah, okay. He was a student at Corman's with Lautrec. Yes, they're buddies. They hung out, yeah. Now, Van Gogh was 10 years older than the other boys, and he was weird, is what they described him. So he would not talk to anybody. He would work in the class all by himself, off in a corner, and then from time to time, he would stand up and start yelling at everybody about artistic concepts, just out of the blue, with his bad false teeth. That's how they described him. And so Henri created this pastel of him, which is now in the Van Gogh Museum, by the way, in Amsterdam. If you ever get there, you can see the pastel by Toulouse. It's a beautiful, beautiful drawing of Van Gogh. Van Gogh's brother, Theo, I'm sure many of you know, that they wrote letters back and forth to each other, was a dealer And he became one of the first dealers of Henri's work. He actually represented Henri's work and then moved to the Goupil Gallery, one of the most famous galleries in Paris, which went on to show many exhibitions by Henri. So that's the pastel of Van Gogh. This is a fun story. So there's a painter named Puvis de Chavannes who was a symbolist painter, basically. And at the major exhibition they had at the time in 1884, this was the star of the show. It was a large painting called The Sacred Grove, Beloved of Arts and Muses from 1884. Gigantic painting, 12 feet across, right? Big painting, was the star. And the students went to it and they looked at the painting, but they were kind of cynical about, all the attention this painting was getting. So they got together and they said, let's do our own version of this painting, right? Typical young, kids, and so here's the version they did. Well, before I do that, let me show you. Here's a figure contemplating art and poetry under the tree. Here's an angel flying in, playing a lyre, right? Here's an ancient building, a ruinous building in the background. And then you have other elements happening, the pathway leading back to the distance, the history of art coming forward with the angels, of course, and the beloved arts and muses of ancient mythology. So here's the painting the boys did. All right. So the woman over here is now holding a pig. She's looking at a painting. It looks like it's probably a Bonnat painting, by the way, the teacher that they, were not happy with, old man Bonnat. The angel's coming in holding a tube of paint, right? The antique structure here has a clock face on it. Right? It's got a clock on it. And here are the boys. Look at them. They go all the way back into the distance. Here's the teacher, Bonnat, with his head down. He's being troubled by art history. And you see what's going on here? Who's that? Can you see who that is, everybody? That's Henri. You know what he's doing? He's urinating. He's taking a pee in the painting. So this is a good example of the story. So here you go. Scandalous, but funny as hell. It was a Lampoon. It was the National Lampoon, right? It was Saturday Night Live, exactly. All right, so here is the first, I think, important painting by Henri, also 18 years old, Etude de Nude, 1882. And think about this painting now. It's done in a very wonderful, classical technique, but at the same time, very expressive bravura brushwork, very fluid brushwork. And here we see a woman on a bed with long black stockings, and she's nude. And she's in this deep contemplation. And so in this painting, to my eye, we see a very evocative sort of work. Lots of levels to this painting. It's erotic, certainly. It may be on the edge of scandalous, perhaps. What's on her mind? What has she done? What is she going to do? What is she thinking about? All that psychological power is already implanted into this mysterious painting at the age of 18 years old. Pretty remarkable. And I think that, again, is viewed as one of his most important works, early works. Yeah, on the back wall.
It looks like
Oh, you mean on the bedspread? Yeah, yeah. Like a cross.
coat of arms.
Yeah. Could be references to his family.
His background.
Yeah, coming through. That's a great observation. Well done. Yeah. Contrasting, of course, with the black stockings.
Yeah.
It makes it pretty powerful. It's an amazing painting. So now we talk about Montmartre. There was an architect named Haussmann, and he redesigned Paris in the 19th century, changed all of Paris. Very influential figure. Haussmann's design, still to this day, when you go to Paris, you're blown away by how beautiful the city is. He left Montmartre alone, never touched it. And Montmartre, if you've been, who's been to Paris before? Okay, have you been to Montmartre, everybody? Up the hill, Le Butte, it's called. And he left it alone, didn't touch it. And so it became sort of the working class part of Paris, where factory workers lived and the more poor people lived. craftspeople lived, and because the rents were cheap, it attracted artists and writers and musicians and brought in the artistic milieu in this area. So it was a bustling area in terms of its artistic aspects, but in terms of its economic aspects, it was a slum, basically, in essence. And so this is an important part of what entered into his life. So as he studied with Corman, as I said, they would work during the daytime. They didn't work at night because there was no electricity in the studio. So they worked during the daytime. Then at night they would go into Montmartre to begin to explore the underbelly, if you will, of Paris society. Particularly for him as a royal, that had to be a really interesting, contrast and distinction. So here's one of the first cafes that he hung out, the Chat Noir, Black Cat. And it was owned by a particular fellow named Salis. The patrons called him Malice. His personality was not very friendly. And he left the cafe, moved to another location, and it was taken over by Aristide Bruant. We're going to talk about him in a moment, who renamed it the Mirliton, which means the toy whistle. And then Bruant eventually went to another one called the Ambassadeurs and opened up his own cabarets. But this is where the artists would come in Montmartre. They'd hang out and they'd talk and they'd display works of art, and they would, debate about what was going on in the world at the time. So it was a very important sort of breeding ground for artistic concepts. And so there it is, circa 1881. There's Bruant, 1866, and he was a dashing fellow, an entertainer, impresario, and I like to call him sort of the Don Rickles of the 19th century. It's really what he was. His thing was insulting people. He had a sign outside his thing. He said, if you want to come in here, be ready to be insulted if you want to come into my establishment. So here's how he's described by Julia Freyd, her wonderful book on Toulouse-Lautrec. He affected a costume of a bohemian artist, a wide-brimmed black hat, red flannel shirt, black corduroy jacket and trousers, heavy sewer cleaner's boots. To go out, he added a black cape and a red woolen muffler draped over one shoulder. His expression was sneering and bitter, but he had a charismatic energy and a very loud voice. His songs were comic, vulgar, and sentimental, declaiming the sadness and deprivation of life in the slums, the brothels, and the prisons. So that's Bruant. Here are two of the great posters of Henri by Bruant. Now, the one on the right, by the way, it's right around the corner. And the one we have here in the exhibition is the rarest version of it because it's what's called before letters. You see the typography at the bottom? It does not appear in that poster. That's because it was printed and held back from distribution for a future advertisement. Before they decided another event he was going to produce, they would add the typography to it and release it to the streets of Paris to advertise it. So the one that we have at the show is, again, a before letters example, which means it was never put on the streets. It was held back by the print studio, so they're extraordinarily rare, and I should say obviously quite valuable as well. So make sure you tune into that. And then look at the one on the other side, too. Isn't that powerful? You see, of course, the black hat, the scarf. He carried a stick around with him so he could smack people with it. And Aristide Bruant dans son cabaret in his cabaret. And the Ambassadors, that was the third establishment that he created. Now let's talk about posters for a minute. The poster, the French call it l'affiche, which really doesn't mean poster, it means sort of art for the streets, art for the masses. And he was an artist who was a breakthrough. He made these people famous through his work, and he achieved fame through the posters. Now, they were put up in billboards and kiosks. You look at the famous Divan Japonais behind me. That poster would have been put up on a billboard advertising that particular establishment, the Café Concert, and someone would rip it down. Sometimes the minute they put them up, they would take them down. People would take them down because they were so enamored by these works and his work. So they'd be displayed in kiosks and billboards. They also would put them on like sandwich boards, put them on a donkey cart, and ride them through the streets of Paris. Can you imagine that? Interesting. They'd ride around. We see that today. Sometimes you see, trucks driving around advertising, right? Same thing happening today. That's the same thing they did. There was one historian, became a friend of Lautrec, that said the first time he saw his great poster of the Moulin Rouge, he was so knocked out by it that he walked alongside of the donkey while he was walking through the streets for several blocks as he couldn't take his eyes off the poster. So he was following it around in the streets of Paris. So there's Aristide. Here's a couple more images. I love the one on the right. Look at that sneer on his face. What do you know of culture? Amazing. So let's talk about the Moulin Rouge. It was not the first cabaret to open, but it was the most infamous and famous, I guess is the best way to put it. And it was a large establishment. It had in behind it a sort of fairground atmosphere. It fortune tellers back there and games and all kinds of crazy things. It had a gigantic papier-mâché elephant with a stage around it. People would perform in this giant elephant. And it had electricity, one of the first places to have electricity and feature it. And they had dancers and performers. Every night of the week, they had masked balls, which were a great activity for people. People love to do that as well. And it's still there. If you go to Montmartre, you'll still see the red windmill, the Moulin Rouge. And very, very famous image. And this is, again, you think of Toulouse-Lautrec, you think of the Moulin Rouge, right? And, of course, this period in French history. Let's talk about some of the characters, the denizens. Here's La Goulou, Louise Weber. Her act was fun. It was wild and crazy. And galou means glutton. She was very, how can I put it, gluttonous, I think is the best way to put it. And she was famous for, in her performance, walking over to tables, picking up people's drinks and drinking them off the table. She was quite the performer, but she was really very interesting. So here you see a painting by Henri. And the reason I wanted to show you this was the gentleman dancing next to the young model. You see him there with the top hat? His name was Valentin le Dessosé, which means Valentine the Boneless. And he was a man that danced. They said his legs were made of rubber when he danced, right? He was very skinny and tall. He always wore a top hat. Even when he was performing, he wore a top hat. He was very famous. He was not a dancer professionally. He had a day job. But at night he would go in the cabarets and dance with these women, and people just loved watching him dance. So there's Valentin, and he's training the new dancers, dressage des nouvelles par Valentin, the training of the new ones by Dessosé. And so you can see the woman dancing there. Her hair has fallen down, by the way. Louise had what they call a chignon, ladies, is that what you call it? You put the little top of the ice cream on top of your head. And so the girls in Paris all adopted that look. That was the rage at the time. They all wanted to look like La Goulou. And this woman had it, but it fell down. You can see it's falling down her back there as well. Isn't that a cool painting? So here's the work. This is the one that launched Henri into fame and launched La Goulou into fame as well. And we look at a very sophisticated work of art here from 1891. This is pretty amazing. So this is the one that would go down the donkey cart, right? And people would just look at it and go, what is that? It's incredible. So we see Moulin Rouge, concert ball, toute la soirée, every night, featuring La Goulou. And then you have the Moulin Rouge. Wednesdays and Saturdays, you have the masked ball. You can come on Wednesdays and Saturdays for the masked ball as well. So there's Valentine in the foreground. See the top hat, right? He's dancing his rubberman dance. And there is La Goulou. Now look at what he did here. It's really interesting. He kept the white of the paper as the focal point, the negative space of the image. And look what she's pointing at you, right? She's pointing her sex directly at you, right? So this is obviously something that's going to shock people and get their attention immediately. So the combination of the foreground with the figure of Valentin, La Goulou in the center, the gentleman in the back pushing back into the space, the silhouette of the background stopping the space, and then the shapes on the left, which are abstract shapes in the composition, are actually the electric lights that appear from the upper angle looking down. She's combining all these elements and perspectives simultaneously.
Thanks for letting me interrupt. Would you briefly tell the audience the procedure, the bill posters, and the stamp that you had to get, but more importantly, did Lautrec work with the topographer? Who was in charge of all the topography?
Yeah. Absolutely. The lithographic studio, he worked with several different studios and several different master printers. Stern was the one that was the most common. I don't know if this one was published by Stern or not. Advertising had been essentially allowed at that point in time, and you had to receive a stamp, an approval stamp to produce them at the time. And the image would be done initially, and then someone else would come in and work with Lautrec to make sure that it was in the right positions. He wanted to know exactly where the typography was going to balance the composition properly and not interrupt what he's trying to do. You see the fold in the center, everybody? See that in the center? It means it was done with two separate limestones because of the size of the stones. Behind me, the Revue Blanche is also a two-stone composition, right? So you see the two pieces of paper put together to create it. Now, when they were put up on display, they were printed on really cheap paper. No one had the intention when they made these they were going to be collector's items. They were just put up for advertising. And so if they survive today, they're mounted either on canvas or on very fine paper to preserve them because the paper would just disintegrate. They were done in editions typically of about 3,000 examples that were printed according to what we've been able to discern. How many survive, who knows, but obviously it's how many were printed doesn't matter. How many you think still in existence today, these fragile pieces of paper surviving. It's extraordinary that they made it, isn't it? That they're still here today after all that time. Well, his lithographs, his original lithographs, he would do 50, 75, 100 examples, but the posters, typically 3,000 were produced. Here's Jane Avril. Now, Jane had a sad story. She was forced into prostitution by her mother. She never knew her father. She claimed he was a royal, but I don't think that was the case. But she came into dancing, and she had cholera, and it gave her a sort of a neurological issue. And when she danced, she was wild in her dancing, crazy in her dancing, and that got the attention of everybody. And he became friends with her, and he really loved her from afar. She really was a woman that he really adored. So here's the famous Jane Avril poster. Henri was also very into Art Nouveau, which was coming out at the moment. You know, the serpentine curvilinear lines and elements of Art Nouveau were important in his work. And so you see Jane, same pose, right? And there she is on stage. And I love the way he portrayed the contrabass there in the foreground and the musician, almost an abstract, almost a surrealist kind of approach to it, isn't it? Again, think about how advanced this was. It was just so remarkable to be producing art like this at the time. And so he did many images of Jane. Over 30 examples of Jane appear in his work in both painting and print. Yep. And here is the cover for La Stampa Originale, which was a portfolio of original lithographs, back to your point about small editions, published for collectors. And this is just beginning to happen. Dealers were beginning to understand, we can have our artists do small editions of graphics. We can make those available to collectors besides paintings. It took quite a while. The French didn't take to it. It was taken much more, I think, appropriately in Europe, throughout Europe, as well, England as well, but not in France. It took, really into the 20th century before people really understood the idea of a limited edition print. But here is Jane Avril. That's Jane in the lithographic studio proofing one of the prints. This is in the collection. You'll see it here in the collection. And there she is, and she's looking at one of the proofs, giving her approval. And there's the printer. Père Cotel was his name. And he's pushing the stone through the press. Can you all see that? Isn't that interesting to see? A little glimpse there. You see the rollers down at the bottom. There's your 2 ink rollers with ink put upon them. Actually, the same colors that are in the lithograph, which is interesting. And then you have to, in those days, you would have to roll it with foot and hand because you can't stop. You have to keep going. So they would do it like this to push it through the stone through the press. There's felt put on top of it. The felt is coming off, as you can see, as it runs through the press. And Père Cotel is looking very tired, up early in the morning. Henri would be out all night drinking. He would drink, till the morning, and as soon as sun came up, he would go to the lithographic studio directly from whatever club he was in or place he was in, start working right away, climb up on top of the table and start working. Here is the troupe of Mademoiselle Eglantine, 1896. Now, isn't that classic Toulouse-Lautrec right there? Can-can dancers, Moulin Rouge, 19th century, Paris, Montmartre. You're looking at it right there. So interestingly, the word can-can meant scandal. That's the interpretation of the word can-can. Most people don't know that, right? We talk about the can-can dancers. And so they were not like the Rockettes, where they would do the same movement, all the same matching movement. They were competing with each other. They were trying to outdo the dancer next to them. So that's why it was called scandalous, because they were coming up for ways to call attention to themselves. See the dancer on the far left there? She's not doing the same thing, right? She's in a totally different position. And that's Jane Avril, the second from the right. That's Jane. And you see the artist at the bottom. You have Mademoiselle Eglantine, you have Jane Avril, Cleopatra, and Gazelle. The dancers had nicknames based upon parts of their shows. That's what people gave them nicknames, like Galou, like the glutton, right? So that's a great piece. This basically was created for a performance in London that Toulouse produced it for. There's the great divan japonais. So let's talk about Japonism, right? So the Japanese opened up trade routes to Europe in the 19th century, late 19th century, and Japanese products were coming in to Paris. And it was the rage of Paris. They couldn't get enough Japonism. They were so excited about it. So they were sending in porcelains and all sorts of wonderful objects from Japan. Many of the fragile ones were wrapped in Japanese woodcuts called ukiyo-e woodcuts, go back for many, many centuries. And so they had never seen them before. French artists had never seen them before, and they were just enamored by them. Van Gogh had a whole collection of Japanese woodcuts that he shared with Henri. And so the influence of what's called Japonism is powerful in French art. It really was added to kind of Impressionism and moved art in many ways into the post-Impressionist approach. So if we look at the poster behind me here, if you can see that, the screen's not blocking you, take a look at the screen. We're looking at that powerful black in the center. Isn't that marvelous? It's a flat, abstract form. If I took that image and turned it upside down, you'd see, it's just a wonderful movement through the composition. If I disassociated you from the subject matter and you look at it, just a series of shapes and forms, it's very powerful. Question coming in.
What is the poster advertising?
It's advertising a cabaret called the Divan Japonais, yeah. And so we have Jane Avril, that's Jane, right? The beautiful red hair. Lautrec loved redheads, by the way. He's obsessed with redheads. And we have the gentleman, distinguished gentleman next to her. There's a little quotation, once again, about the upper class mixing with the lower class, right? Love to have that adventure. She's in the performance venue. The use of color, again, remarkable. That olive green color in particular is remarkable in his work. Yep. And look how the orange is just in that one spot, just for her hair. I had to prepare a separate stone just for that. That's how much perfection he had in his work. So you see, again, the wonderful curvilinear lines, all those elements, but the Japanese aspect is the flatness of form, the open areas and patterns of activity versus non-activity. It's a very Asian approach in composition. The negative space as important as the positive space, very crucial as well. We talk about musicians. What you don't play is as important as what you play. Miles Davis said, play the space, when you're improvising. And so you see that element as well. Then you see the strong contour lines, the outlines of the figures. Look at the chair outline, for example. Look at the line of the contrabasses in the background, the lines of the conductor's arms, the line of the dress of the performer, right? That the strong contour lines come out of Japonism. And then the contrast of patterns. Very important element in Japonism as well. Henri developed a technique where he would splatter the grease onto the stone with a brush. He would mask off areas to protect areas, and then just take like a brush or a toothbrush and just splatter the grease on, build up these wonderful areas of texture and tonality on the lithographic stone, which is remarkable. Arguably his most famous poster. I think this is the one that most people know and have seen before. Yes?
You're talking about patterns, and on that one specifically, we were noticing that the gray scale behind looks more regular than a splatter. How would that have been applied to the stone in such a regular?
You talk about the gradation of the grays? Yep. So what he would do is he'd mask off the other areas, and then he would take that area and continue to splash it with the grease. And the grease is inked, so you can actually see that what's being applied is ink put into the grease, so you can see it. So he would just continue to develop it in areas. He'd have darker, lighter areas as well. And he would vary the thickness of the grease as well, the viscosity of the grease to be able to do that, to have lighter areas and darker areas. And of course, when they printed it, they could change different colors, use a different color, for that process. So the singer on the wall in the background is interesting. Her name was Yvette Gilbert. She was the one I showed you the quote about describing what he looked like when he took off his glasses. That was Yvette. And she was famous for wearing long black gloves. That was her trademark. And they had a marvelous relationship. She eventually became great friends with him, but it was tumultuous in the sense that he did lots of depictions of her. He actually made two portfolios of her performances, and she hated the way that he depicted her. She begged him to change them because he was not making her flattering in terms of how she looked. She kind of upped her nose and kind of a strange face. He what?
He made her famous.
He did make her famous, but he didn't make her famous the way she wanted it to be. Yes, so she was always complaining about how she looked, how he made her face. Would you please make me prettier? She kept saying to him. And so he thought that was funny. So he made this famous poster of Divan Japonais, and he put her on the stage wearing the black gloves so everybody would know it was her, and he cut her head off. He's like, that's what you get. You don't like the way I depict you? Here's what you get. And there she is. And there's Yvette with her black gloves. And here's the frontage page for the portfolio. It's right there, actually. Yeah, right over there. Here's a good example I was talking about with his draftsmanship. Just look at that. Just exquisite line. And you think about that. Just taking that stone and just dropping it onto that lithographic stone, taking that crayon rather, and just fluid line, no hesitation. See the stage light at the bottom? Even the lighting is remarkable in terms of that approach. Her signature put on the stone and his put on as well to begin the suite. Couverture. Here's Misha Nathanson, and her husband, Teddy Nathanson, was the publisher of the Revue Blanche. Very, very famous periodical that was produced that was one of the most influential at the time. Great writers, critics, artists, all sorts of people contributed to it, and Henry did many illustrations for it and contributions. Became great friends with the Nathansons. They were a Jewish family that came in from Eastern Europe and settled in Paris. Misha was from Russia, and she was a beautiful woman as well. So there's the Revue Blanche. They came out twice monthly. So it was only 60 cents or 12 francs a year if you wanted to subscribe for the year. Now, if you know the answer to this, don't blurt it out. Lee, I'm talking to you. Anyone want to guess what she's doing there? Take a look at the poster behind me. Look at the angle of her body. Look at the position of her left arm as she's holding the muff. Look at why she's where she's looking, and don't look at the crazy ostrich feather on her hat. She was ice skating, exactly. Who said that? You didn't know that? It's Cheryl said that. Of course it was Cheryl, right? Okay. She was ice skating, yeah. She read it in the catalog. But you can tell, right? Doesn't it look like she's ice skating? She's gliding toward you. That's amazing. Think about that. The minimal amount of visual information, so wonderfully executed that we have the feeling that she's moving right before our eyes. They're beautiful. They dressed beautifully back then. Yeah. She's wearing the veil, right, and the ostrich feather. And Henry loved hats. He would always go in the milliner and buy great hats for his models. And he loved to have exotic hats on his models as well. Here's one of my favorites. This is Misha in the cart with the painter George Condor, called the Partie de Campagne, out to the country. Isn't that beautiful? Just lovely, elegant, gorgeous lithograph. This was made for collectors. This was not an illustration, advertisement. I love the little collie dog. It's like we have the perspective of the dog in this piece. The couple rides out to the country for a lovely afternoon picnic. One of the only images with this extensive landscape in his work too, which is nice to see because again he wasn't a big fan of landscape. Marcel Lender, another very famous singer. She despised him, and he made her famous. And she said she acknowledged the fact. She said he made me famous, but I hate. You can have his art. You can take it and shove it. Basically, is what she said. It was terrible. She wore these obnoxious carnations in her hair. And he loved her from afar. He said she had the most beautiful back he'd ever seen on a woman. And he would go to the shows where she was performing night after night to the same show. He'd keep bringing all his different friends with him. Let's go see Lender in this performance. And they kept saying to him, Henry, how many times have you seen this show? Aren't you bored with it yet? He said, I don't go for the show. I just want to see Lender's back. Then there's the famous lithograph. So that's in the show too. Yeah, right behind me over here. This is 8-color lithograph, 8 stones. That's really complex. And that's one of his most, I think, prodigious examples of lithography. Isn't that extraordinary? Look at the caricature of her face, capturing it in again, that sense of movement. It's hard for us to appreciate how incredibly avant-garde this work was. And, a lot of people, a lot of historians really believe that he was making his work for future generations. He was not interested really in what people of his time were seeing in his work. He was visioning, a completely different approach. And it was true. It was very, very appropriate. Here are the two Mays. We have May Belford and May Milton. And this is interesting because he made these posters for these performers for their own use. They were not made for an advertising project. He just gave them to them. And here's May Milton right here to the right, dancing. Again, really interesting work compositionally. Talk about negative space in the composition. This wonderful sense of movement and dynamism, elegant sort of flow of the triangular composition with the typography working behind her, her face as well. Really wonderful piece. So there we have the two posters. So there's the ladies, and there's the posters that he made for them. He made these in a small edition, And so it's extraordinary to find them today because they were not, again, made in the edition of 3000 intended to be placed on the billboards. He made them for the ladies that they could use for their own purposes. Maya Belfort had kind of a weird show. She dressed up like a little girl, and she held a black kitten in her dress, and she bleated out her song like a little child when she performed. And she had her famous song was, "My daddy won't buy me a doggy, but he bought me a cat." Okay, it was not lost on the French. The double entendre was definitely taken by the French. And May Milton was a kind of a mediocre dancer, but Henri liked both of these ladies. There is the Picasso painting, the famous Salon Bleu. So there's the May Milton. See the poster on the right there, and there it is in Picasso's painting from 1901. See it in the background? Yeah. So this is pretty powerful, pretty profound. This is the blue period, of course, of Picasso. He had just come to Paris. He was destitute. He was a poor, starving artist. This is painted over another painting. He didn't have any money to buy canvases, so he would go into second-hand stores, buy a horrible painting. Somebody was dumping in paint over it because he couldn't afford to buy canvases. And so there's another painting underneath this painting, but he painted it in 1901, which is the year that Lautrec died. And so, yeah. He looked it up in the summer, yeah.
Either June or July.
Yeah. And so the homage, of course, to Toulouse in that work, which had this profound, element having done the same time he died. So here's a good example of what I was talking about before, his paintings as studies for lithographs. Now, when he made his paintings, interestingly, they were kind of like colored drawings. As I mentioned before, he painted on raw cardboard and painted on canvas, raw canvas and cardboard. And he would mix down his pigments with turpentine, get them very, very loose, if you will, and draw. Really, they're sort of colored drawings, really focused on drawing as opposed to the painterly approach of classical painting that he studied as a student. So here is the Englishman in the Moulin Rouge. The individual was a man named William Warner, who was a painter, a British painter who came to study in Paris. And then he studied for a few years, and he went back to Paris and became, kind of famous, not particularly famous, but he was sort of successful. But Henri's not casting him as the painter; he's casting him as the Englishman, coming in, the aristocratic Englishman, and there he is hitting up the ladies in the bar, which is amazing. So there's the painting, and here is the lithograph. And this is arguably the most valuable work in the collection. It's right around the corner. Make sure you take a peek at it. I think it's in the back room back there. An amazing piece. Now, think about the astonishing technical approach to this work. Casting the Englishman in a single color, right? Isn't that interesting? Nobody was doing that back then. It's almost fauve-like, if you will, or even almost like something out of an Andy Warhol work of art, So I suspect, I don't know this for certain, but I suspect something was going on in the printing, and he got to the point where he maybe was going to add other stones to articulate the figure of the Englishman and said, no, I want to stop right there. That's the way I want it to be. Sometimes we have those accidents that take place, and we decide we're going to we like where it is so much we don't want to touch it again. I don't know that for sure. I just suspect it because it's so extraordinary and so unusual in terms of what people were doing at the time. Look at the expression on his face, of course, as he's chatting up these gals, and then look at the gals. The one is pulling back from him like he has halitosis, right? And the other one is looking at him with this evil look in her eyes, like, what can I take this guy for, And just an amazing piece. So this was done in a limited edition, right? And it's hand-signed in pencil. That was really extraordinary back then for artists to sign works, and numbered as well. It really didn't happen until the 20th century when you see really the whole concept of limited edition hand-signed graphic works.
Can you go back to the...
Sure. There's the painting, which is the study for the lithograph, and there's the lithograph. Amazing to see it, isn't it? Now here is the L series. I'm going to get close to finishing up here in just a few minutes. This is really extraordinary. So Henri spent a lot of time in the brothels. As I mentioned earlier, there was no woman who would want to marry him because he was, so unattractive and because he carried this genetic potential problem for having children. So he found solace with the women who would accept him, and they were in the brothels. And he had deep relationships with many of them. It was not just sexual relationships. They became his friends, his confidants. They didn't view him the same way as society viewed him. And so he would bring his easel in and paint in the brothels. He'd actually paint in them as well. And so he produced, a lot of work in the brothels. And he decided in 1896, one of the last works he created, to create a series of lithographs called L. And they're on the wall behind you. All 10 of them are right there behind you, including the wall over here. These are groundbreaking masterpieces in the technique of lithography. They're absolutely exquisite and amongst his most wonderful images. Look how beautiful that work of art is. I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. You see the image here on the left, and just, the top hat laying there on the sofa. So poetic, so touching, the woman fixing her hair. Is it before? Is it after? What's taking place here? What has taken place here? And you can just go right down the line and look at every one of these images. I only showed 3 of them on the slide. So here's the one called Femme sur le dos, woman on her back, lassitude, which means exhaustion. Woman on her back, exhausted. It's on the wall over here. Look at the drawing. Look at the draftsmanship in that work. That's just jaw-dropping. You see the hat on the bed. She's thrown her hat on the bed. She's exhausted from her day's work. And here we are peering into the personal lives of these women. There's no sexual acts taking place here. It's not about that. It's about what these women do, what their lives were like behind the scenes in the intimate world of their lives and work. And they're amazingly insightful works. They were published. They were done in a limited edition, released in portfolio, and there were poor sales. They sold very poorly. People were not interested in collecting these works at the time. Today, they're considered some of the greatest examples of lithography ever made, and very historic. To see the whole set is truly extraordinary. They come up individually at auction, but to see the entire set is really rare, so take that in. Here's the Famo tub, which is a stone masterpiece. You look at the poor color of this slide, then look at the print right there. I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. Look at that composition. Look at the balance of that work, the colors, all the different types of inks he used, the different textures. Absolutely exquisite lithograph. That's the pinnacle of the technique of lithography right there. And he's just beginning. He's just exploring it. Here is Chaoukao, which basically meant chaos in French. And she started out as a acrobat. Here's a photograph of her performing. She could bend in all sorts of crazy positions and stuff. That's how she performed, right? And then when she stopped doing that, she got heavy. She became overweight and had to retire. And then a few years later, she decided to have a comeback. And she came back as a clown in the circus. Very sad. And that's her in the circus. So that was called the Clowness Assis. And you see her sitting there kind of contemplating her past. She's lost a little bit of weight there, not quite as heavy as she was previously. But it's tragic. It's a tragic work. Talk about how we lose our skills as we get older. We lose all sorts of aspects of our lives, and we have to come to terms with that. I haven't noticed it myself, but... And here's the last lithograph he created, the Jockey, 1899. And this was supposed to be a series of works that he created, a whole series on the jockeys and the race, but it never completed. A little bit of a landscape in there as well. But look at the musculature of the horse, and the sense of movement in that composition, the rhythms, the movement, the two riders having this wonderful relationship spatially, creating a really sense of wonderful dynamism. To think that he created that when he was just completely in an alcoholic stupor is amazing, isn't it? Yeah, experiencing paranoia and hallucinations and drunken alcoholism. Artist influence, we talked about a few of those. Picasso, we talked about the early Picasso. This painting is in the Barcelona Museum. Anyone been to the museum, Picasso Museum, Barcelona? Oh, you got to go if you don't. Yeah, go to Barcelona. Make sure you go to the Picasso Museum. If you don't, I will never speak to you again. Just so we're clear on that, okay? Leroy Neiman. Leroy Neiman is a carbon copy of Toulouse-Lautrec. How many of you know Leroy Neiman's work? Anybody? Yeah. 1970s, 80s, 90s. Casinos, celebrities, boxing matches, great sporting events. He captured his time perfectly with this wonderful artistic genius who was a brilliant draftsman. He adored Toulouse-Lautrec. He worshipped Toulouse-Lautrec. And he was also flamboyant. He had a big mustache and a cigar. Remember the Rocky movies? He was the ringman in the Rocky movies, right? And the ring announcer in the Rocky movies, right? So Leroy Neiman, heavy influence. Peter Max. Yeah. How many times did Peter Max depict Toulouse-Lautrec in his work? Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Some of you know the artist Itzhak Tarkai. He was an artist I knew dearly. He was one of my great friends, passed away 2012, sorry. Great artist. He loved Lautrec. I just want to end with a few quotes for you. So here are some people talking about Henri. This is Paul Leclerc, who was a writer and critic. Sometimes he would hold his hand to his brow like a visor for a few seconds, blink a few times, stare at a corner of the scene before him, pull a little sketchbook out of his pocket, make a quick note with one pencil line, and shove the sketchbook back into his pocket. This minuscule sketchbook, about as big as a matchbox, was always with him. It was the diary of his impressions. His line drawings told where he had been and what he had seen. Each of his sketches about the theater carried the weight of profound commentary or skillful revelation. Here's a Gustave Joffre, again a critic, very famous critic in Paris. Lautrec lends himself easily to cruel mockery as he makes us visit dance halls, bordellos, and unnatural couplings, but he retains his integrity as an artist, his power of observation, and his refusal to see his subjects as pitiful supports the beauty of life. The defiant philosophy of vice he sometimes ostentatiously displays, given the strength of his drawing and the seriousness of his diagnosis, has the effect of a clinical demonstration, a lesson in morals. That's some powerful, powerful words, huh? Isn't that incredible?
Is his sketchbook?
Oh, I don't know. Good question. That's a good question. Well, Park West actually acquired a sketchbook from him, but it was when he was 14. It was his early drawings, so we had that in our archives. But the little one, I don't know. I haven't come upon that in even my research. Good question. We should. I bet it's in Albee. Yeah, we should get into that. We should go there. Yeah. Let's get a plane. Let's hire a plane. You ready to go? Okay. I love the south of France, huh? All right. Here is Arsène Alexander, another really important artist and friend of Lautrec's as well. There is something tragic in the thought of what the great city sometimes does to her rarest talents, to her most precious minds, the great city, right? The life of Lautrec. The final one I'll leave you with is my favorite because it's right off Facebook. Okay? This is a troll from Facebook, okay? This could be somebody writing about one of us right now, okay? Lautrec's a guy with a hell of a nerve and lots of guts. His drawing and his colors don't beat around the bush. Big, simple patches of white, black, and red. That's his scam. Nobody can match him at snagging the snoots of capitalist pigs, chowing down with loose chicks who lick them on their snouts to make them pay out. And those idiots who want everything in spun sugar really get left with jam on their faces. Is that good or what?